cells necrosis, and that is surrounded by epithelioid cell, which are modified macrophages, and also surrounded by some giant cell, and also some sensitized T lymphocyte are also seen in the picture. And this entire type of lesion is known as a granuloma. So that was in short about the pathogenesis of pulmonary tuberculosis. And one thing you have to remember, although this cell-mediated immunity gives us protection, but at the same time, in many individuals, it can cause cavitation and other problems. So moving on to the next topic, now we will discuss about primary and secondary tuberculosis. So primary pulmonary TB refers to the pattern of TB that we see in a previously unexposed and therefore unsensitized individual. So the primary infection usually occurs in the upper part of the lower lobe and lower part of the upper lobe of the lungs. The initial infection will have 1 to 1.5 centimeter diameter. There will be grayish-white inflammatory lesion, and that is known as gone focus. And I have already talked about gone focus, so this is in fact a gone focus. And later there will be also lymph node involvement, and gone focus along with the nodal involvement is referred to as gone complex. So as you can see, I have also drawn a simple flowchart here. So this is primary infection, and then there will be primary TB. Now what will be the fate of primary TB? In most of the cases, the primary TB is contained. It may either heal, and then we will call that healed TB. And in that...
Okay, this is a lot now. A lot of scientific fucking... But they asked me in high school what I wanted to take for my extra, like the drama fucking... We were only on drama, music, dance. Everybody dance. What was the other one? Fucking drama, art, music, dance. Or 4. Only fucking courses I wanted to take, apparently. I wanted to do something in the fucking grow room that they have in Billings. And they were like, no, that's not for students. I was like, okay. What was it on? Physics. And they were like, okay, serious. And I think I said mechanics, auto mechanics, and they were like, yeah, no, girls don't really get in that course because they're a distraction. And then I asked woodworking, and then once again, was told to get serious because obviously they're not going to put me in woodworking and lose a finger. Molecular mechanism.
Hi, my name is Sharon Chen. This video is about diagnosis of tuberculosis infection and disease. The learning objectives are to distinguish latent tuberculosis infection, or LTBI, from active TB disease through clinical and laboratory findings, to describe how TST and IGRA function to diagnose TB infection, to describe how TSTs are placed and interpreted, to explain why IGRAs can distinguish between infection with MTB versus vaccination with BCG, to list some of the differences between TST and IGRAs and recognize their limitations in diagnosing TB infection and disease, and to articulate the value of MTB culture in the diagnosis of TB disease. I want to first give you a historical perspective about TB diagnosis. First of all, clinical diagnosis of latent TB infection is impossible. Remember that the person is asymptomatic. In 1882, Koch was able to identify MTB as a causative agent of tuberculosis, and the next obvious step was to find a cure. Out to be a terrible mistake. Tuberculin was a preparation of dead bacilli that elicited a necrotizing response in granulomas, but did not sterilize tissue. It was later that the tuberculin reaction was noted to be a useful way to detect latent TB infection. Diagnosis of latent TB infection and active TB disease is different. Diagnosis of active TB disease is based on clinical signs and symptoms and diagnostic testing. Diagnosis of latent TB infection is more difficult. There are no clinical signs and symptoms. Diagnosis is then based on considerations of the level of exposure and the risk of progressing to TB disease. Diagnostic tests that are used include the tuberculin skin test, TST, interferon gamma release assay, IGRA, and culture of MTB from body fluids and tissues. In the next slide, I'm going to give you details that can help you diagnose latent TB infection versus active TB disease because it can be very difficult. Let's start with latent TB infection. The point here is that we are looking for evidence of TB infection without evidence of TB disease. You should look for the following. Ask about exposure to MTB and specifically consider the duration, frequency, and proximity to evaluate the risk. Make sure there are no signs or symptoms of active TB disease. If you have suspicion of TB exposure, you can do a TB test, either a TST or IGRA. For latent TB infection, these should be positive. If the TB test is positive, obtain a chest radiograph, which is normal or shows evidence of an old inactive calcified nodule. You can see this calcified nodule in the top chest image. The red arrow points to it. This person does not have active TB disease. We look for the following things to diagnose active TB disease. All of them may not be present in a person with disease. Again, you should ask about exposure to MTB. In TB disease, the person does have clinical signs and symptoms of pulmonary and possibly extrapulmonary disease. The TST or IGRA should be positive. The chest X-ray in this case is abnormal. In the bottom chest image, you can see a cavity in the left upper lobe apex region. The red arrow and red dot point to it. In addition, you can obtain AFB stains on sputum or tissue, which may show MTB bacilli. You should also obtain culture of sputum, body fluids, or tissue, which may grow MTB. Molecular assays such as PCR can also be done that can detect MTB in these specimens. I'm going to now tell you how the tuberculin skin test works to help diagnose latent TB infection. In the US, the tuberculin preparation we use is called PPD, or purified protein derivative. So sometimes you will hear this test called a PPD test. PPD is essentially a preparation of dead MTB bacilli. PPD is placed intradermally into the forearm with a tuberculin syringe to produce a raised bump of tuberculin. This initial raised bump will disappear. I hope you can see from the slide that placing a TST is tricky, and inappropriate application can affect interpretation of this test. The principle of TST is to detect the memory T cell response to MTB antigens. Injection of PPD, that is the MTB antigens, in the skin is picked up by dendritic cells patrolling the skin. The dendritic cells migrate to a local lymph node presenting the MTB antigens to an MTB-specific memory T cell. This activates the memory T cell, which then migrates to the injection site and releases pro-inflammatory cytokines like TNF-alpha and interferon gamma to kill MTB. The red bump response is a result of these pro-inflammatory cytokines, and this response takes 48 to 72 hours to appear. Interpretation of TST is based on two factors. First is the measurement. This is reported in millimeters of the diameter of the amount of induration, or the bump, not the redness. There are 3 breakpoints at 5, 10, and 15 millimeters. The second factor is the risk of progression to active TB disease. The higher the risk of progression to active TB disease, the lower the measurement cutoff is for interpreting TST as a positive test. For example, as you can see in the table, if a patient has HIV, she is at very high risk of progressing to TB disease, so her cutoff is set at greater or equal to 5 millimeters for interpreting TST as a positive test. In contrast, in someone with no risk factors, the cutoff is at 15 millimeters. There are many challenges to interpreting the TST. False negative results can occur, so perhaps think about what could make this happen. One possibility that I've already mentioned is from incorrectly placing the TST. Now recall how this test works. It measures the memory T cell response, So people who don't have a normal immune system can have a false negative result. If you do this test early in TB infection before the latent period, the test may be falsely negative because the T cell response to MTB has not yet developed. Finally, false negatives can also occur in very severe or disseminated TB disease. The reason for this is not clear, but likely has to do with a compromised adaptive immune response. False positives can also occur because of cross-reactivity of the TB antigens used in TST to other mycobacteria, including non-tuberculosis mycobacteria and even the mycobacteria strain used as a vaccine called BCG. Because of these challenges, a new diagnostic test has been developed recently. It is called the interferon gamma release assay, or IGRA. Similar to TST, IGRAs detect a memory MTB-specific T cell response. In this case, it is a blood test instead of a skin test, and it measures the actual amount of one of the pro-inflammatory cytokines, interferon gamma, instead of measuring the induration caused by all of the pro-inflammatory cytokines. The TB antigens used to elicit the memory T cell response in the IGRA are very specific, not the undefined mixture contained in PPD. These specific TB antigens were chosen to reduce the false positive TST results from BCG vaccine and from environmental non-tuberculosis mycobacteria. The fact that we can choose specific TB antigens means that there are important differences between pathogenic and non-pathogenic mycobacteria. BCG vaccine is composed of an attenuated Mycobacterium bovis isolate. When people were trying to figure out why this M. bovis isolate was attenuated, they compared its genome to the parental virulent M. bovis and to M. tuberculosis. They found several regions of the genome that were lost in the attenuated M. bovis BCG isolate. One region, called RD1, contains the genes for a secretion system and its secreted effector proteins that are important for granuloma formation. IGRAs use peptides from these two MTB proteins. There are some differences between TST and IGRA, and the table shows you advantages and disadvantages of each. One test is not necessarily better than the other. There are also limitations of both TST and IGRA. These tests are an indirect measurement of MTB infection. It is measuring the immune response, not the presence of microbes. It cannot identify early or primary MTB infection before T cell responses have been activated, which you will recall takes about 3 to 9 weeks. It cannot distinguish between latent TB infection and active TB disease. It also cannot predict risk of progression to TB disease. So how do we definitively diagnose active TB disease? The gold standard is culture. And this is the only way to show definitive infection and the only way to obtain drug susceptibility. So I want you to remember that when you are diagnosing active TB disease, you need to obtain cultures. But growth in cultures is very slow and takes 4 to 6 weeks. Here's a
We basically caused a metabolic disease in the Mycobacterium tuberculosis that led to its rapid death. Tuberculosis is a lung disease that's caused by a bacterium called Mycobacterium tuberculosis. It's actually the oldest bacterium that was proven to be associated with a human disease, and it's transmitted by simple aerosol infection, so you could just get it on the subway. Although we don't see a lot of it in the United States and Europe, it's a huge problem in the developing world. There's at least 8 million new cases every year and at least 2 million deaths per year. And unfortunately, in recent years, because of the growing HIV epidemic, which has collided with tuberculosis, the problem of tuberculosis has worsened, both with the numbers of cases and the emergence of strains of M. tuberculosis that are resistant to all the drugs that we use to treat it. Mycobacterium tuberculosis is a free-living organism that causes disease. My lab has been focusing on developing the tools, genetic tools, where we can study the genes of this organism. And by inactivating genes, we figure out the function of the various genes of M. tuberculosis. In our most recent study, what we've discovered is of the 4,000 genes in M. tuberculosis, when we inactivate this one gene, which is named GLGE, it leads it causes M. tuberculosis to poison itself. And it basically commits suicide. Our study was published in the March 21st issue of Nature Chemical Biology, and it reveals a brand new carbohydrate pathway that we didn't know of before that takes, a simple sugar to another sugar. The surprising result was when we blocked a specific enzyme in that pathway, we basically caused a metabolic disease in the Mycobacterium tuberculosis that led to its rapid death. So the next step is to develop a drug that...
As funny as that is, like... Fucking...
Tuberculosis, or TB, is one of the oldest and most common infectious diseases. About 1/3 of the world population is believed to be infected with TB. Fortunately, only about 5% of these infections progress to active disease. The other 95% of infected people are said to have a dormant or latent infection. They do not develop any symptoms and do not transmit the disease. Tuberculosis is caused by a rod-shaped bacterium, or a bacillus, called Mycobacterium tuberculosis. An infection is initiated following inhalation of mycobacteria present in aerosol droplets, discharged into the atmosphere by a person with an active infection. The transmission process is very efficient, as these droplets can persist in the atmosphere for several hours and the infectious dose is very low. Less than 10 bacilli are needed to start the infection. Once in the lung, the bacteria meet with the body's first-line defense, the macrophages. The bacteria are ingested by the macrophages, but manage to survive inside. Internalization of the bacilli triggers an inflammatory response that brings other defensive cells to the area. Together, these cells form a mass of tissue, called a granuloma, characteristic of the disease. In its early stage, the granuloma has a core of infected macrophages enclosed by other cells of the immune system. As cellular immunity develops, macrophages loaded with bacteria are killed, resulting in the formation of the caseous center of the granuloma. The bacteria become dormant, but may remain alive for decades. This enclosed infection is referred to as latent tuberculosis and may persist throughout a person's life without causing any symptoms. The strength of the body's immune response determines whether an infection is arrested here or progresses to the next stage. In healthy people, the infection may be stopped permanently at this point. The granulomas subsequently heal, leaving small calcified lesions. On the other hand, if the immune system is compromised by immunosuppressive drugs, HIV infections, malnutrition, aging, or other factors, the bacteria can be reactivated, replicate, escape from the granuloma, and spread to other parts of the lungs, causing active pulmonary tuberculosis. This reactivation may occur months or even years after the initial infection. In some cases, the bacteria may also spread to other organs of the body via the lymphatic system or the bloodstream. This widespread form of TB disease, called disseminated TB or miliary TB, occurs most commonly in the very young, the very old, and those with HIV infection. Tuberculosis is generally treatable with antibiotics. Several antibiotics are usually prescribed for many months due to the slow growth rate of the bacteria. It's very important that the patients complete the course of the treatment to prevent development of drug-resistant bacteria and reoccurrence of the disease.
Okay. Yeah, 2 years, 2 years, 3. Smooth. Okay.
Journalist James Nachtwey photographed people with tuberculosis in South Africa, Cambodia, and other countries for this slideshow being displayed around the world. Health experts say tuberculosis is preventable and usually treatable, yet it continues to afflict around 9 million people each year. It kills one person every 20 seconds. Nachtwey's pictures are being distributed by a coalition called Action. Joanne Carter of Action in Washington says because of decades of neglect, TB has now developed into newer, deadlier strains. Some are extremely drug resistant.
Even though this disease kills nearly 2 million people every year, is the biggest killer of people with AIDS, but there's 500,000 cases of drug-resistant TB estimated, new cases every year. This issue is receiving very little attention, and the hope is that these photographs could actually bring
Scare. Those photographs could scare people. Look what happened in Africa. This will happen here. AZT. No. T. Thank you. So Fauci also invented AZT. No shit.
"30 years ago, the Food and Drug Administration approved AZT for the treatment of AIDS. At the time, it was a miracle drug that gave patients up to a year of life. Acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, known as AIDS, is the last stage of the human immunodeficiency virus HIV. There is no cure for HIV, but the disease can be controlled with treatment. Treatments for HIV and AIDS have progressed since the approval of AZT. Patients can choose from dozens of medications to fight the disease. Now, antiretroviral drugs make it possible for people diagnosed with HIV to live longer lives. But the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention reports more than 6,700 in the U.S. died from HIV or AIDS in 2014. And the World Health Organization estimates about 1.1 million people died from AIDS in 2015. In 2015, President Barack Obama updated the national HIV/AIDS strategy for the United States. It set goals to reduce new infections, increase access to care, and improve health outcomes for people living with HIV, among other objectives. And despite proposed funding cuts to the Department of Health and Human Services, the Trump administration says HIV/AIDS programs should be the department's highest priorities.
Oh yeah, that's it.
I can't let diabetes get in the way. I've got way too much stuff to do.
Why?
So here's what I do. I wear this Dexcom G6. It continuously sends my glucose numbers to my phone. And this arrow shows me where I'm headed and how fast.
Okay,
Making
One Direction, I guess.
Well, the reason that only one drug has been made available, AZT, because it's the only drug that thus far has been shown in scientifically controlled trials to be safe and effective. It isn't the question of there are a lot of drugs around and only one is being released. That's the only one that has been shown to be effective. Well, first of all, it's certainly understandable when you're dealing with a frustrating and very difficult situation such as AIDS, particularly if you're someone who has the disease or is afraid of getting the disease, that things are moving too slow. In fact, we always want things to go more quickly. If you look at the clinical trials that are going on now, there are a number of drugs that are in clinical trial. Hopefully, they will be expeditiously shown to either be safe and effective or will be discarded because they're proven not to be safe and effective. But things are moving along. It's understandable how there's always the perception that things are going slow. And I think that just reflects the very difficult nature of the disease and the emotional charged nature of it. Oh, absolutely, you can. You can always make things quicker, and that's what we're trying to do, is constantly reevaluating, getting outside consultants, reevaluating our own approach and the approaches that can possibly be changed. We never are complacent to say, yes, this is the best it can be. You can always do things better, and that's what we're trying to do. Well, there are a number of drugs that are in trial now. It's difficult to say that one is more promising than the other, and that's the reason for the trial, to determine if they're promising. Alpha interferon is one, dideoxycytidine is another, foscarnet, AL721, all of these are in trial, either alone or in combination with AZT. There are several of them now. Well, it's a double-edged sword. First of all, the virus can and is being spread heterosexually. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, it certainly is not spreading in that explosive way that we saw it was spreading through the homosexual population a few years ago. So on the one hand, you don't want to be complacent because of that, because you know that if you let your guard down and feel that you do not need to be careful, you don't have to worry about sexual practices or safe sex or what have you, then what you might see is an increase in cases in the general population. I might point out that the predominant spread into the heterosexual population in this country, in the United States, is predominantly around the IV drug abusing population and their heterosexual partners. So if you look, for example, in Manhattan, in South Bronx, in New Jersey, or in Miami, where there's a high concentration of IV drug abusers, the heterosexual spread is focused in those areas with high IV drug abusing populations. Yes. Yeah. Sure. Well, I think if you ask virtually any scientist who's involved in this area, his claims are really extraordinary. They're way off base, and he puts forth a negative hypothesis. He says everything you've heard is wrong, but I'm not going to give you any alternative. It's really unfortunate because what he's doing, he's creating a tremendous amount of anxiety in the people who are infected because they think that there's some conspiracy among scientists against them. It really is very unfortunate. It's coming from him, he has some qualifications. Something happened to him in his thinking over the past couple of years. I don't know what it is. You're welcome.
You should find something to figure it out.
Okay. Okay.
Sherry Lewis, a singer and AIDS educator, has been HIV positive for almost 25 years.
I went for the blood test for my marriage license. Then 3 weeks later, on April 12th, 1987, my 33rd birthday, 3 months before my wedding day, the doctor called and told me on the phone that I was, in fact, positive.
At that time, it was practically a death sentence.
Once,
The first time I encountered patients with HIV was during my residency training in Boston in 1985. Most of the patients had very advanced disease and we didn't have any treatment. People didn't make it out of the hospital.
In the late spring of 1981, on my desk was the June 5th issue of Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report. 5 gay men from Los Angeles, very, very sick with a pneumonia that you only see in people who are immunosuppressed. 1 month later was the second report of 26 individuals, again, curiously, all gay men from LA, San Francisco, and New York, all presenting with this unusual syndrome of not only pneumocystis pneumonia, but several of them had Kaposi sarcoma. And I can remember thinking, my goodness, this is something really new and really scary.
The physicians, even in infectious.
I'm sorry, can you watch your fucking. Oh, interesting.
Acquired immune deficiency syndrome. No one with AIDS has been cured.
AIDS is now the leading cause of death among young people in this country.
I came out in my freshman year of college in 1983, and so this was something that I had to deal with every single day.
While difficult to look back, Jeff Graham says there are familiar parallels between the AIDS epidemic of the 1980s and today's coronavirus pandemic. Graham is the executive director of Georgia Equality, an LGBTQ organization.
And there was so much that was unknown at the time. Frankly, the sense of not knowing what to do, not knowing where you can go for information.
Before we knew what caused AIDS, scientists called it cancer. The unknown bred fear. Today, there is still much to learn about COVID-19, creating similar anxiety.
What is this virus? How dangerous and deadly is it? What are the repercussions? How many folks will get sick? How do you deal, frankly, when your friends and family members die unexpectedly? Those are some of the issues that we're going to have to be dealing with that are the same.
At first, much of the public incorrectly thought only gay men contracted AIDS. Right now, some still think the coronavirus is a threat to only the elderly, as these spring breakers showed us last month.
What is there to do here other than go to the bars or the beach, and they're closing all of it? It's really messing up. I think they're blowing it way out of proportion.
We had a really extraordinary meeting.
One familiarity gives Graham comfort. It's seeing Dr. Anthony Fauci and Dr. Deborah Birx.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Each day during the presidential press conferences. Both were leading researchers combating AIDS. Today, they're guiding us through the coronavirus.
These are two people, I've known their work since I was 19 years old. And I know that because they did so much of their early professional careers working on HIV, that they have found a good balance between strong public health intervention and respecting the human and civil rights of individuals.
Graham says one of the most important lessons the AIDS epidemic taught the country was to resist the urge to blame marginalized communities. When the president calls COVID-19 the Chinese virus, Graham says it casts a bias against an innocent population, just like some people did to gay men during the AIDS epidemic. I'm Andy Parati.
That is Andy Parati reporting for us, and the correlation between epidemics of 40 years ago and what we are experiencing now. While the diseases and the transmission radically different, certainly there are correlations that gives everyone pause for reflection. Cheryl?
Oh, fuck this. No. Do it.
Hello, I'm Dr. Linda Reed. Welcome to the Medicine for the Layman series at the National Institutes of Health. Today we're going to be listening to Dr. Anthony Fauci. He's going to be talking about AIDS, the acquired immunodeficiency syndrome.
We keep hearing about how we're in uncharted waters with COVID-19, which is true. You'd have to be even older than an American presidential candidate to have seen a pandemic of this scale before, but it's not accurate to say that this is all new territory. For those of us that have been knocking around the world of medicine for a while now, or those with an interest in history, there's a lot about this that's eerily familiar. We've been here before, and we didn't really learn. People in countries like the UK and US have been expending energy shouting at their respective governments for their responses to the pandemic. But the truth is that the damage was done a long time before a bat, a pangolin, and a human decided to have a three-way in Wuhan. Scientists have been warning that it was only a matter of time before a virus like this went on a world tour, and they were ignored. What's worse, in many countries they saw their funding cut. Governments have been ignoring scientists saying things they didn't want to hear since time immemorial, so why would it be any different now? Enjoy your time in the sun, epidemiologists. Once this is all over, people are going to go right back to not knowing who you are and caring more about Kylie Jenner than Edward Jenner. Society had become complacent. We whooped so many diseases, RNA asses, that a pandemic simply wasn't a realistic concern. In very recent memory, we dealt with a previously unseen virus that started killing people without a cure in sight, could be spread by unwitting asymptomatic carriers. The government dragged their feet before finally suggesting that covering up might prevent its spread. Minority groups were worst affected, leading to inaccurate speculation. Desperate people started turning to unproven therapies. Conspiracy theorists cashed in. The British eventually ran a landmark treatment trial. And at the heart of the battle against this virus was a certain Anthony Fauci. I don't mean SARS-1 or H1N1. I'm, of course, talking about HIV and AIDS. I've always been fascinated by this period in history, I think partly because most medical historians tend to gravitate towards the truly wild, olden days of medicine when doctors were clearly just legal trolls that competed with each other to invent the most ridiculous ideas and pretend that they were therapies. Goat testicles surgically inserted inside your scrotum? Yes, please. I'll take two. So more recent history often gets a bit overlooked, even though it was just as momentous. Of course, Fauci isn't the only public official involved with COVID-19 that was also involved in the response to HIV. Dr. Deborah Birx is the current White House coronavirus response coordinator and worked on HIV and AIDS at the NIH in the 80s. And Vice President Mike Pence, who chairs the same committee, undermined government policy meant to curb the spread of HIV when he was governor of Indiana, delaying the implementation of preventative measures, making an outbreak worse than it should have been. Indiana's response is regarded as a key failure in dealing with a virus, and Pence is now in charge of America's response to COVID-19. The pace at which HIV spread was totally different to COVID, of course, but the parallels of countries ignoring red flags popping up all over the world and reassuring people that there have only been a few cases to the current situation are striking. There aren't many currently practicing household names in medicine. Anthony Fauci is about as close as they come. His name adorns the monstrous tome in every medical student's room. He has dedicated his life to medical research and policy, and I've been aghast by the vitriol directed towards him, not only from the public that he serves, but from within the White House itself. He's been the subject of memes and conspiracy theories similar to ones about Bill Gates or George Soros, that he's some nefarious puppet master. But they're billionaires. He's a doctor, a researcher. I wondered how he stays so unfazed by it. Well, because this isn't his first rodeo. Many Americans died from HIV because the government moved too slowly. That is true, and Fauci himself found himself in the firing line. Activist Larry Kramer took out a full-page ad in the paper calling Fauci an incompetent idiot and a murderer. And just like today, he was branded a pill-pushing stooge of the pharmaceutical industry. But what Fauci did next was unprecedented. He sat down with the protesters, he listened to them, and he changed policy, ensuring that the normally slow-moving wheels of the FDA sped up. Kramer would go on to call him the only true and great hero amongst government officials, and the two became friends. Fauci is an uncommonly virtuous public figure. Not much bothers me, but I've been really disheartened to see this man painted as a bad guy. At a time when many scientists have been showing their own inherent biases on either side of the political spectrum, Fauci has been an incredibly neutral voice. He's one of the only medics willing to say that all mass gatherings run the risk of spreading coronavirus, whether spring breakers or Black Lives Matter protesters. Reagan's government was accused of not caring about LGBTQ and immigrant communities who were bearing the brunt of HIV's devastating effects, just the same way Trump's government is accused of indifference to the plight of minority groups today. Scientists started speculating on why gay men and other marginalized communities seem to be worse affected, and came up with all kinds of theories that seem daft to us. I've talked about in the previous video, but essentially health outcomes always mirror social factors. Furthermore, initial reports about HIV gave the impression that it was only the 4 H's who were at risk: Haitians, heroin users, hemophiliacs, and homosexuals. Indeed, the very first report of the disease was a case series of 5 gay men afflicted with a mysterious new illness, and from then on it was known as the gay plague. This led the wider public to believe that they weren't at risk. Sound familiar? From the offset, we were told that only the elderly and the infirm were at risk of COVID-19. Now, the elderly are at highest risk from COVID, but their risk is not theirs alone. One thing I've been asked about a bit after recent videos on race is vitamin D. Now, I didn't want to make a whole video about it, so I'll briefly mention it here because it's yet another example of familiar territory. In essence, a lot of people have leapt on the vitamin D bandwagon to explain why people with darker skin have died from COVID-19 more than white people. It seems logical enough. Low vitamin D levels are associated with more severe COVID-19, and darker skinned people do have higher rates of vitamin D deficiency. I know several prominent people on the internet have latched upon it, and many just assume it's proven fact, just like a global game of Chinese whispers. Okay, perhaps that's not the best idiom to choose. To those familiar with medical research in various fields over recent years, this is a false dawn. The same theory has been proposed for stroke, falls, asthma, heart disease, and many more. There's no end of studies where they've looked at people's vitamin D levels and found it correlates with severity of disease, any disease. In each case, it led people to ask if low vitamin D was predisposing patients to whatever the disease being studied was. But correlation is not causation. Vitamin D levels drop in the elderly, and what those many previous studies have shown is that vitamin D is a marker of frailty, not a cause. And frailty makes you more susceptible to all disease. Should you ensure that you're not vitamin D deficient? Of course. But it's not the reason that more Black people are dying from COVID. Another...
Hey, yeah.
Good morning. So, today.
Interesting.
Hey guys, I know it's a weird time right now. A lot of us have been stuck at home for a bit, some voluntarily, some not. And you can't check social media or turn on a TV without seeing something about a horrifying global pandemic. Whether you think quarantines and closures are an overreaction or not, I think everyone of every political persuasion can agree on at least one thing. Our government has not handled this COVID-19 thing very well. For weeks, doctors in the U.S. weren't allowed to test patients for the virus at all. Then, the only tests available were from the CDC that took a week to get results. And many of those tests turned out to be faulty. Not only did FDA regulations prohibit private labs in the U.S. from developing their own tests, they barred unapproved tests that were already successfully in use in other countries from being imported. The first major outbreak in Washington was discovered only after a Seattle lab decided to ignore the regulations and run their own tests in defiance of the FDA. Fortunately, the government did eventually drop their prohibition on private labs developing their own tests, which are much faster and, work. But there were still a number of regulations imposed by the FDA and other agencies that stood in the way of rapid progress in fighting the disease, like prohibiting at-home testing and restricting companies like Tesla, Ford, and GM from producing and selling ventilators, even though they'd offered to do so. These problems have come as a surprise to a lot of people in the US, but they really shouldn't. The FDA has a long history of slowing the progress of innovation in healthcare. And since you're probably stuck at home, instead of rewatching Outbreak or Contagion for the 13th time, I'd like to direct your attention to a much better movie on Netflix that actually addresses some of the underlying problems our country is facing right now: Dallas Buyers Club. Stick around for this short edition of Out of Frame. Dallas Buyers Club was released in 2013 and tells the mostly true story of Ron Woodruff, played by Matthew McConaughey. If you haven't seen it, go ahead and do that, then come back to this video, because I'm going to be spoiling some key plot points. Feel free to subscribe and hit that bell icon while we wait. In 1985, Ron Woodruff was diagnosed not just with HIV, but full-blown AIDS. At the time, HIV and AIDS were not well understood by the American public. Most people considered it a gay disease and didn't think it was a problem even worthy of serious attention. Thanks to a deadly combination of ignorance, anti-gay sentiment, and the novelty of the disease itself, drugs that could treat HIV were barely available anywhere. AIDS was spreading rapidly, with nothing to stop it or help those who got it. When Ron got the news, his prognosis wasn't good. He had just 30 days left to live. But there was a sliver of hope. Researchers at the National Cancer Institute had just proposed a breakthrough treatment for HIV using the antiretroviral drug azithromycin, or AZT. Unfortunately, in 1985, AZT was just starting FDA-required human trials. And while we all know that rigorous testing is super important, what most people don't realize is that the nature of the FDA process takes a really, really long time. And for most medical R&D companies, navigating the bureaucracy can cost over $1 billion per drug. So even fast-tracked, it would still take over 2 years for the AZT trials to be completed, and only then could it have been submitted for approval in the US. Who knows how much longer that would take? Ron's doctor's only recommendation is to go to a support group for other AIDS patients condemned to die.
Screw the FDA. I'm going to be away.
The first act of Dallas Buyers Club is really hard to watch. Reeling from his diagnosis and being rejected by his former rodeo cowboy friends, Ron had nothing left but to hustle. He makes a deal with an orderly at the hospital to steal AZT from the trial. Once that gets cut off, he goes to an unlicensed doctor in Mexico. After a couple months of fairly successful treatment, he and the doctor set up a deal to smuggle unapproved drugs into the US and sell them to other desperate HIV patients. This eventually leads to creating the Buyers Club in Dallas. Ron isn't actually selling the drugs and supplements. He's selling a club membership. And club members just happen to get access to these treatments as a perk. Unfortunately for Ron and his club members, he keeps bumping up against the FDA and their enlisted help, the DEA and the IRS. Ron is fined, his medicine is confiscated, he's threatened with arrest. Ron attempts to fight back, filing a restraining order against the FDA. That doesn't work. He sues the agency for denying him his right to treatment. That fails too, even though the judge agrees that the FDA's behavior is morally reprehensible. Ron just wanted to survive and believed that all people have a right to try risky treatments when the alternative is certain death. We see this play out over and over in real life. People with conditions and diseases like HIV, cancer, autoimmune disorders, and more suffer needlessly because the FDA won't approve drugs that have been used in other countries for years. People who use medical marijuana and psychedelics to treat physical and psychological problems understand the obstacles the FDA and other government agencies put in the way of drug research and approval, in spite of the fact that the federal government actually holds patents on a lot of those treatments. It even affects people who just want to drink the milk they want to drink. Right now, places like New York City are seeing firsthand how FDA restrictions that prevent companies from urgently importing and producing much-needed medical supplies like ventilators, masks, and other protective gear can cause really serious problems. And it doesn't stop with the FDA. We've all talked a lot lately about overloaded hospitals and our limited capacity to treat COVID-19 patients. But what most people don't know is that the government and the American Medical Association limits the number of doctors we train. And we've known for years that we would face a real shortage in healthcare providers, something we really don't need right now. Worse still, most cities have what's called Certificate of Need laws that prevent the development and construction of new hospitals. Con laws allow other hospitals and clinics in certain areas to decide whether their potential competitors can expand their capabilities or enter the market at all. Contrary to popular belief, healthcare in America is far, far from a free market. And it's precisely that bureaucratic, centralized control and the regulatory restrictions that are killing us right now, just like they did in the 80s during the AIDS epidemic. Oh, and by the way, thanks to illegally acquiring AZT, Ron Woodruff beat his 30-day prognosis by 7 years. And today, the drug is approved and used in AIDS treatment and prevention all over the world. The good news is that finally, some of these rules are being lifted, if only temporarily in some cases, allowing people to get what they need when they actually need it. If you're searching for silver linings right now, it could be that after this is all over, maybe, just maybe, more people will realize how involved government at all levels already is in their everyday lives, health, and well-being, and reject plans to expand its role in the future. We need life-saving medicine and medical technology right now. And the best way to incentivize rapid innovation, production, and distribution is by allowing entrepreneurs to do what they do best. But to do that, we have to reduce the artificial barriers, price controls, and top-down political authority in the healthcare system. The lessons of economics aren't magically suspended in life or death situations. To the contrary, learning them now is more important than ever. Hey everybody, thanks for watching this short edition of Out of Frame. I know this one was a little different than usual, so be sure to let me know what you think in the comments. If you want to know more about the FDA and the other regulations I mentioned, check out the links in the description, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to all our social channels on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
No, it's not tumor. Not a tumor. Ollie. Valentine Dagan. Jewish. Old Jewish man.
Edward Snowden is an American.
Sorry. Right, yeah. It's a good thing I took home, Um. Yeesh. Okay. Um, If you find $10 somewhere, go to my account. And I fucking need gas money. Come here. 2 seconds. What the fuck? How? Do you use this shit?
Yeah, at least we can kill everything. It's gonna kill everything. Have a slow start.
I got a lot better run than this time. Do it. That'd be awesome. Hell yeah. I'll even build Keeper Secret so you can use Slaanesh. It's not that complicated. You cast a spell, it does good things, and you smack real hard. Well, I mean, I don't know. It's not that bad, really. It's just. Let's see. Oh. Ooh. That's cool. That's really cool. Yeah. Well, Slaanesh has archers. It's kind of, It's kind of like one of their things. Oh shit, there's another mother. here. I hit it once. Okay, voice is down. This guy's kind of close to his audience. Okay, so shit. Nobody's gonna pause it. Wait, are you gonna push your them? There was a guy right there. Oh shit. What was he trying to say? It's these suits, man. They're actually pretty powerful.
A lot of people don't care. Like, I saw a guy hit my truck while I was right in front of my truck. I was like, "What the fuck are you doing, man?" He's like, "Oh, I'm sorry. Like, I don't care about my car." I'm like, "Yeah, well,
I
that's
care about
cool.
my life.
I care about my car. Like, it's the only way I can get around."